You know what is interesting about men who succeed late in life? They rarely look like future success stories while their lives are still being built. Most people imagine a successful man as someone who shows promise early, moves quickly, makes confident decisions, and reaches visible milestones before anyone begins to doubt him. But the psychology of late success tells a very different story. Many men who eventually build extraordinary lives spend years looking uncertain, delayed, overlooked, or even completely lost. What appears from the outside to be failure is often a long period of psychological construction that nobody else can see. These men are not always moving slowly because they lack ambition. They are often moving slowly because they are still separating their own ambitions from the expectations they inherited from everyone around them. Late success is rarely a sudden miracle that arrives out of nowhere. It is usually the visible result of invisible changes that have been accumulating quietly for years. Here are 11 psychological traits commonly found in men who succeed much later than people expected. Sign 1. They spend years living a life that does not fully fit them. Many late successful men begin adulthood by following a path that looks reasonable but feels strangely empty. They choose the practical degree, accept the stable job, become dependable, and learn how to perform a version of success that makes everyone else feel comfortable. From the outside, nothing appears seriously wrong. Inside, however, they experience a growing sense that they are becoming competent at a life they never consciously chose. This internal mismatch can last for years, because responsible men are often praised for endurance long before they are encouraged to examine what they actually want. They remain in the wrong environment not because they are weak, but because they are capable of surviving it. The same adaptability that later helps them succeed can initially keep them trapped in places that slowly drain their identity. Their first great psychological task is not learning how to achieve more, but recognizing that achievement on the wrong path still feels like failure. When they finally admit that the life they built does not belong to them, the admission can look like collapse from the outside. In reality, it is often the first honest decision of their adult life. Sign 2. They develop a complicated relationship with time. Men who succeed late usually spend years watching other people reach milestones before they do. They see younger colleagues advance faster, friends buy homes sooner, former classmates become respected, and relatives quietly begin to lower their expectations. This creates a particular kind of pressure, because the man is not only trying to improve his life, but also trying to outrun the story that he has fallen behind. For a while, this pressure can make him impulsive, ashamed, or obsessed with catching up. Eventually, however, the men who truly rise learn something psychologically important about time. They stop treating life as a race with a universal schedule and begin treating it as a sequence of individual seasons. They understand that being early is not the same as being ready, and being late is not the same as being incapable. This shift does not remove urgency, but it removes panic. Once panic disappears, they can make decisions based on direction instead of embarrassment. They no longer ask whether they are ahead of other men, because they are finally focused on whether they are moving toward a life they can respect. Sign 3. They have often failed in ways that damage their identity. Late success is rarely preceded by a neat collection of useful mistakes that become inspiring stories immediately afterward. It is more often preceded by failures that feel personal, humiliating, and difficult to explain. A business may collapse, a career may stall, a relationship may end, or a long period of effort may produce almost nothing visible. What makes these experiences powerful is not the failure itself, but the way it forces a man to separate his identity from his performance. Before that separation, every setback feels like evidence that he is fundamentally defective. After that separation, failure becomes information about strategy, timing, environment, skill, or judgment. This psychological distinction changes everything, because a man who no longer interprets failure as a verdict can study it without being destroyed by it. He becomes less dramatic about setbacks and more precise about causes. He learns to ask what failed, instead of automatically concluding that he is the failure. By the time success arrives, he is often more resilient than men who were rewarded too early to develop that distinction. Sign 4. They become less interested in appearing impressive. Many men who succeed late spend their younger years trying to look successful before they understand how success is actually built. They buy symbols, speak with unnecessary certainty, pursue titles, and compare themselves with people whose lives they do not genuinely want. This performance is not always vanity, because it is often a defense against the fear of being insignificant. Over time, repeated disappointment makes the performance exhausting. The man begins to notice that looking successful and becoming effective require very different psychological habits. Looking successful demands attention, while becoming effective demands concentration. Looking successful rewards quick impressions, while becoming effective requires long periods in which nobody is impressed at all. Late successful men gradually become willing to disappear into the work. They stop announcing every plan because they have learned that speaking about progress can create the emotional sensation of progress without producing any real change. Their confidence becomes quieter because it is no longer designed for an audience. Sign 5. They learn to tolerate being misunderstood. The moment a man abandons a conventional path, the people around him often become uncomfortable before they become supportive. His decision may look irresponsible, unrealistic, ungrateful, or unnecessarily risky to people who only understand the identity he has already performed for them. Late successful men often discover that changing their lives requires disappointing those who benefited from the old version of them. This can be especially difficult for men who built their identity around being dependable, agreeable, or easy to explain. They must learn that being understood is emotionally comforting, but it is not always a reliable guide for making important decisions. Sometimes the people closest to you can only imagine your future as an extension of your past. A man who succeeds late eventually becomes willing to act before other people can see what he sees. He accepts that clarity often arrives privately before it becomes visible publicly. This does not make him careless about advice, but it makes him more selective about whose fear is allowed to influence his direction. He understands that misunderstanding is sometimes the temporary cost of becoming someone new. Sign 6. They become unusually honest about their weaknesses. Early in life, many men protect their self-esteem by avoiding situations that reveal what they cannot do. They stay near familiar strengths, blame circumstances, or keep changing goals before any one goal has enough time to expose their limitations. Late success often begins when this avoidance becomes impossible. The man finally looks directly at the skill gap, the poor discipline, the emotional pattern, the financial ignorance, or the fear that has quietly shaped his decisions. This moment can feel brutal, because honest self-assessment removes the comforting explanation that the world simply failed to recognize him. But it also returns power to him. A weakness that can be named can be trained, managed, delegated, or designed around. A weakness that remains hidden continues to control choices from the background. Men who succeed late are often not the most naturally gifted men in the room. They are the men who eventually become more accurate about themselves than the people competing against them. Sign 7. They stop waiting to feel confident before acting. One of the most persistent myths about successful men is that they move because they believe in themselves completely. In reality, many late successful men begin their most important chapter while still feeling doubtful, embarrassed, and afraid of wasting more time. Their change is not the disappearance of fear, but the end of treating fear as a command. They learn that confidence is usually produced by repeated evidence rather than discovered through endless reflection. Every difficult conversation, completed project, rejected proposal, and uncomfortable attempt gives the nervous system new proof that uncertainty can be survived. Gradually, action becomes less dependent on mood. The man no longer needs to feel powerful before doing the thing that would make him more capable. He becomes willing to begin badly, learn publicly, and improve without protecting the image of being naturally talented. This is often where his life starts accelerating because perfection is no longer blocking repetition. Late success belongs disproportionately to men who become consistent before they become confident. Sign 8. They become protective of their attention. Men who succeed late often lose years not because they are lazy, but because their attention is repeatedly captured by problems that do not deserve their life. They remain available to every request, argument, crisis, distraction, and person who expects access to them. Because they are capable, other people learn to use their capability before the man learns to direct it. Eventually, he notices that exhaustion is not always evidence of meaningful work. Sometimes it is evidence that his energy has no boundaries. He begins removing obligations that produce movement without progress. He stops giving his best hours to people who only bring urgency, confusion, or emotional noise. This can make him appear more distant, but psychologically, he is learning to protect the conditions under which serious work becomes possible. Attention becomes a form of capital, and he stops spending it carelessly. His life changes when he realizes that focus is not merely the ability to concentrate, but the willingness to disappoint distractions. Sign 9. They build patience without becoming passive. Before maturity, patience often feels like waiting for circumstances to improve on their own. Late successful men eventually develop a more active form of patience. They continue working while results remain invisible, but they also keep measuring whether the work is producing the right kind of movement. They do not confuse persistence with loyalty to a failing strategy. They understand that some goals require more time, while others require a completely different approach. This balance between endurance and adaptation is psychologically difficult because quitting too early and staying too long can feel almost identical from the inside. Through experience, they become better at distinguishing temporary discomfort from structural failure. They learn when to endure, when to change direction, and when to abandon a path that no longer deserves another year. Their patience is not passive optimism, but disciplined contact with reality. That is why their later progress can appear sudden, even though it was built through years of careful adjustment. Sign 10. They redefine what success is allowed to mean. Many men spend the first half of life chasing goals that were handed to them before they had enough self-knowledge to question them. They pursue income without freedom, status without peace, responsibility without purpose, or admiration from people they do not even respect. Late success often becomes possible only after the definition changes. The man begins asking whether the life created by the goal is actually a life he wants to inhabit. He becomes less impressed by achievements that require permanent self-betrayal. He starts valuing autonomy, meaningful work, physical health, trustworthy relationships, and the ability to sleep without feeling that his entire life is an act. This redefinition may initially look like reduced ambition. In reality, it is ambition becoming more precise. He is no longer trying to win every game that society places in front of him. He is choosing the game whose rewards are worth the cost. Sign 11. They carry a quiet grief for the years they believe they lost. This is the trait that ties many of the others together. Even after life begins improving, men who succeed late often struggle with the thought that everything should have happened sooner. They imagine the money they could have earned, the confidence they could have developed, the relationships they could have protected, or the opportunities they might have recognized if they had understood themselves earlier. This grief can become dangerous when it turns the past into a courtroom and the present into a punishment. But the men who continue rising eventually reinterpret those lost years. They recognize that some lessons could not have been absorbed through advice because they required direct contact with disappointment. They understand that their slower path gave them judgment, humility, emotional range, and resistance to illusions that early success might never have challenged. The years were not always efficient, and they were not always fair, but they were not necessarily empty. Much of the man they needed to become was being formed during the period when nothing appeared to be happening. Late success does not erase regret, but it can transform regret into responsibility for the time that remains. What is interesting about all 11 of these traits is how consistently they are misread while the man is still becoming. The man who changes direction looks unstable, the man who becomes quiet looks defeated, and the man who starts again looks as though he has wasted his previous life. The man who withdraws from distractions looks antisocial, while the man who admits his weaknesses looks less capable than the man who keeps pretending. But sometimes what looks like delay is actually a difficult period of psychological alignment. Sometimes a man does not rise early because he is still learning which parts of himself are real and which parts were built for approval. When he finally succeeds, the result often appears stronger because it is no longer supported by fantasy. He knows what failure feels like, which makes him less fragile when circumstances change. He knows what imitation feels like, which makes him less likely to abandon himself for applause. He knows what wasted time feels like, which makes his attention far more deliberate. At its core, Succeeding late is not simply about reaching wealth, status, or recognition after a delayed beginning. It is about becoming psychologically ready to hold success without allowing success to become another costume. The men who rise late often carry fewer illusions, clearer boundaries, deeper patience, and a more honest understanding of what their lives are actually for. They may arrive after everyone expected them to, but they often arrive with a foundation that earlier versions of themselves could not have built. If this video described a man you know, or a version of yourself that is still being formed, leave a comment with the trait that felt most accurate. If these words gave language to a season that has looked like failure from the outside, share them with someone who may need to hear that delay is not the same as defeat. I am Turnwiser, and I hope you remember that a late beginning can still become a powerful life when a man finally stops living on someone else's timeline. Do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the next video, and I will see you again soon.